Hello all the crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and welcome back to Getting Started Making Games in GameMaker. So, in the last couple of videos, we talked about the different types of loops that you can use in code in GameMaker, and different ways that you can make code repeat various numbers of times until some condition is met. And today we are going to take a hard left turn away from that. We are going to talk about collision detection. So collision detection is going to be something which underpins a lot of things that you would do in a game. And that includes not only things like having the player stop when they hit a solid wall, but it also includes things like making the player shoot a bullet at an enemy, and you want to figure out when the bullet intersects the enemy and when the enemy should take damage. Things like when you click on an object, you want to figure out if the player's mouse cursor is actually like on top of the object or not. Collision detection underpins a lot of different things that you might do in games. So, for this example, I'm going to actually not use the sample project that we've been using so far in the series at all, which has these various like tiles and the player sprite which animates and which looks left and right when you move around. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to a much simpler example project, and we're going to look for a little while at a world that's full of nothing but squares of different colors. And the reason for this is that when you are working with collisions and when you are trying to develop a collision system or test out a collision system, having a lot of pretty graphics which might animate in different ways actually tends to get in the way and makes it harder to see what you're actually doing. For example, the knight character, when we're doing our run animation, this guy has multiple frames, and in some frames, when you're trying to figure out if an object is actually touching or overlapping another object, having a sprite which like animates and moves around like this can actually make it a little bit harder to see if your character is actually touching the object or if it's like off by a few pixels in some direction or the other. And for that reason, pretty much anytime anyone ever in games, and this ranges from someone who's just working on their own solo projects to huge AAA games, anytime anyone ever in games is going to work with collision systems, test collision systems, they will just replace all of their graphics with like geometry of solid colors like this, so that the work is just that much easier. Anyway, so GameMaker has a bunch of different ways of dealing with collisions, and it actually has so many that it's kind of a problem, and I'll probably rant about that later on. The first thing you might notice is that when you open up an object, the object properties, you'll see a solid checkbox, and the solid checkbox is something that you should pretty much never use. I'm not going to use it here. I'm not really going to dedicate any time in the video to using it here. It is essentially a system which allows GameMaker to attempt to handle collisions for you, and that sounds great, but the problem with that is that it does exactly one thing, and if you want specific types of control over your collisions, you generally don't want that. It also doesn't work if you mess with like object coordinates like this exactly. It doesn't really mess if you set the X and Y positions of your object yourself. It only works if you deal with things like the H speed and V speed, which are built into GameMaker, which is another system which GameMaker will try to handle for you, and generally isn't a good idea because it will, again, take control away from you as the developer, and if you don't like what it does by default, there's not really anything you can do about it. So, what we're going to do instead is we are going to handle this ourselves. So, another way of handling collisions that GameMaker gives you is going to be in the events list. You have a collision event, and you can select an event which is going to happen whenever two objects touch each other. So if I go back into the room, and okay, so I do have a couple of these OBJ solids here. If I go into the room, and if I go and define a collision event with OBJ solid for the player, we can say when we hit OBJ solid, we can do something like, and I'm going to do something dramatic just so that we can see it happening. Let's say X equals 0, Y equals 0. We're essentially going to teleport back to the corner of the room. And that, you can see, is going to make something happen. So when I touch this yellow object, when a collision is detected, we are going to teleport back to the corner of the room. This is better than using the solid checkbox because this is an object event and it won't do anything. It won't modify your position for you, but it will trigger an event which you can type your own code into. This is sometimes useful. This isn't like the solid checkbox, which you should basically never use. Collision events like this are sometimes useful, but different events in GameMaker tend to run into the problem of when you have a bunch of them, it just gets a little bit difficult to manage. And there's a couple of other problems with using object events like this. things that happen on their own in between other events in GameMaker, which usually boil down to the fact that like if you have a step event here, there might be a specific time and place in which you want to actually handle collisions in between other code. And if you just use the object events like that, you kind of lose that. So we're going to delete the collision event with obj solid, and we are going to look at simply handling this through code ourselves. So the first thing I'm going to do is, instead of modifying the player's x and y coordinates directly when we hit the arrow keys, I'm actually going to save the result of this. I'm basically going to save the difference to a variable. So I can say local variable. I can still make this text size bigger. Local variable move x equals 0, and then local variable move y equals 0. And I can say when you hit the right key, move x plus equals 4. When you hit the left key, move x minus equals 4. When you go up, move y minus equals 4 and plus equals 4 when you hit down. And then when we're done with that, we can say x plus equals move x and y plus equals move y. And this is going to accomplish the same thing, but instead of modifying the x and y position of the objects directly, I'm going to save the potential movement until we're done with this, and I'm going to then apply it at the end. If I run the game now, it's going to do exactly what we did before, minus teleporting when we hit that wall, because we deleted the code that did that. And this might seem like a bit of a pointless distinction, but what this allows us to do is, and to be clear, there's a million different ways that you can implement movement and collisions in a game, but the reason that I have chosen to do this is because now that we've defined the potential movement before we actually act on it, we can do things like checking this distance ahead. We can check the potential destination of where the player is going to end up. We can see if there's a collision with another object there, and if there is, we can just not do anything. We can void the movement. And the way that we might do that is, there is a handy function, place meeting. And this function is going to take 3 arguments. One is going to be an x coordinate, one is going to be a y coordinate, and another is going to be an object type that we're going to check for collisions with. And it's going to return a true or false, depending on whether or not there is a collision at that coordinate. So I can say if place meeting x plus move x, y plus move y with obj underscore solid here. And by the way, I forget if I said anything about this earlier, but obj solid doesn't have any code in it. It just exists. So it has a sprite. Everything else is pretty much the default that it would look like when you create a new object. So we can say if place meeting x plus move x, y plus move y with obj solid, that means that something is here, and we are going to want to probably not do this. Else we can carry out our movement. You can also just reverse this condition. You can say if not place meeting, and you can do it that way, but I want my code to somewhat represent how I'm speaking in English right now. So now if I run the game, and if I were to move, I can move around now. I'm not in collision, but if I were to move up to this yellow wall, you can see that I can't go through it. So this is the basics of collision detection in GameMaker. And that's great. It feels like we've accomplished something. However, there's a couple shortcomings, and if you play around with the system for a few minutes, you can probably notice a couple of them. There's a couple different ways in which this is not really convenient. One is that if I hit 2 different directions at the same time, I can move diagonally. If I'm not in collision with anything, so I can move to like the upper right or the bottom left or whatever I want. But if I were to run up to the wall, and you can't see it, but if I'm going to hold right and up at the same time, I can't, like, shimmy across the wall the way that you might hope. I can't really slide around the wall or around the corner. And that is because we're checking for our potential movement on the X and the Y axis at the same time. So there's a couple things going on here that it's important to understand about the place meeting function and what exactly GameMaker is doing when we run this code. So firstly, the place meeting function, when you run it within an instance like this, it checks for collisions by taking the object that you're running it in. In my case, we're running it in the step event of the player, so it's going to take the player object, and it's basically saying, if this object were to move to this new position, would there be a collision? And it's just going to return true or false depending on that. And GameMaker has a whole bunch of other collision functions that you can use if you need different behaviors or if you need to check collisions based on different criteria. And we'll get to that later, but for now we're just going to talk about the place meeting function. And the second thing that's going on here is that we are checking for a new position on the X and the Y axis at the same time. So if I were to just hit the right arrow key, GameMaker would check for a collision at this position. So move X is going to be like 4 or something, and move Y is going to be 0. And we're going to essentially teleport our player 4 pixels to the right and check for a collision. And in this case, GameMaker is going to say, yeah, there's an object there. Place meeting is going to return true, and we're not going to move. But if I were to hit both the right and the up keys on the keyboard at the same time, for example, we're going to check for a position that is 4 pixels to the left and 4 pixels up from where we were. The zone of collision that we're checking for is going to be here, and GameMaker is still going to look at that and say, yep, there's a collision there, you can't move, and you will not be able to move. It's not going to separate movement on the horizontal and the vertical axis. It's not going to decide that, okay, you can't move on the x-axis, but you can move on the y-axis, so when you hit right and up in this position, you should be able to, like, slide up and down the wall. So, if we want to do that, what we can do instead is, instead of doing a single collision check, instead of doing a single place meeting with both the x and the y, like this, we can do 2 collision checks, and one of them is just going to look at potential movement on the x-axis, so x plus movement x, and y plus nothing, because we're just going to check our self-same y position. And if there is no collision on the x-axis, we can move on the x-axis, and we can do a second one after that, that is going to be just no movement on the x-axis, and we're going to check for collision on the y-axis, and if there is something in front of you on the y-axis, you'll stop, and if there isn't, you'll just move on the y-axis. And that is going to allow us to run up against the wall, but now, if I hit up and down next to the wall, we can, like, slide our faces up against the brick or something like that. That would hurt. Don't think about that too hard. Anyway, this definitely feels a lot more natural to what you would expect to be able to do if the player ran into a wall at an angle like this. And it works from if you come in from any direction, up, down, top, bottom, whatever you want. Now, you can't really see it the way I have it set up in this example here, but there is still another problem here. And that is that, so in this level setup, the player is going to be at position x equals 128, y equals 96. This wall object over here is going to be at position x equals 320. And the player is exactly 192 pixel units away from the wall. And that happens to be a number that's divisible by the speed in which we're moving. So if you move 4 pixels every frame and you have 192 pixels to go before you hit the wall, then you will hit the wall exactly in 48 frames. 192 is perfectly divisible by 4. However, if that was not the case, let's say that we're moving 5 pixels per frame or something like that, or let's say that the wall is a different distance away that isn't perfectly divisible by my movement speed. In that case, you might not be able to actually get perfectly up to the wall. So if I were to replace these keyboard check function calls with something like keyboard check press, because I want to see what's going to happen when I move in a specific discrete increment. And I think I'm also going to change the movement speed to like 16 so that this doesn't take forever. Let's see. If I were to run this just like this, you can see that I'm going to get closer to the wall, and then I'm going to snap perfectly to it. Like this. But if I were to pick a different a different increment of space, let's say if I were to move 20 pixels at a time instead of 16, if I run this example again, I can't get closer to the wall than this, because if I move 20 pixels to the right, then even though there's going to be this buffer of space in between me and the wall, the game is going to check for collisions at this position. It's going to say there is a collision at this position, and it's going to prevent me from getting any closer to this. And as usual, in GameMaker, there's a couple different ways you can deal with this, but by far the most common way to deal with this is going to be, instead of checking for collisions at a specific interval like this, whatever the move speed is, we can go into a loop and we can check for collisions 1 pixel at a time, moving the player 1 pixel at a time, and we can go into a loop and we can just do this until the player hits something, and when the player hits something, we'll At that point, we'll have them stop. So, using any of the loops that we talked about in the last video, I can say, instead of doing if place meeting x plus move underscore x, I can say if place meeting x plus, let's say 1. Check for collisions. If there is no collision, x plus equals 1. And we can go into a loop and we can repeat this many times. Like this. And I'm not going to do it on the y-axis yet. But now if I run the game, every time I hit the right key on the keyboard, we are going to jump a couple pixels to the right until we get here. This is where we stopped last time, but now if I hit it again, we are going to move that last little distance until we're actually touching the wall. And if I try to go beyond this, then, well, we can't, because there's something in the way. And I could, now that I see this working, we can do it again on the y-axis, so that this also works when we go up and down. This is still not perfect, and we'll get to some minor adjustments that we'll have to make to this to make it work in general in a minute. But now I can move down, we can move right, we can go around the obstruction. So one problem with this is that I can only go in the positive x and y direction, because if move underscore x, if you're trying to go to the left, this value is going to be negative, and if you go into a loop a negative number of times, that doesn't really make sense. So what we can do instead is we can do a little bit of mathematics to this to make this work. And I can say repeat the absolute value of move underscore x. And now the absolute value, you might remember this from math class, this is just the magnitude of a number without the positive or negative sign. So the absolute value of 20 is 20. The absolute value of negative 20 is 20. So now this loop will still run even if you're going in the minus x or minus y direction. However, we will need to adjust the position that we're checking if we're going in the minus y direction or the minus x direction rather. And the easiest way to do that is going to be by using the sine function. And the sine function, not to be confused with like sine, S-I-N-E, the trig function, but the sine function is just going to return positive 1, 0, or negative 1, depending on whether or not the input number is greater than 0, equal to 0, or less than 0. So if move underscore x is positive 20, it's going to be, the sign of that number is going to be 1. If move underscore x is negative 20, the sign of that number is going to be negative 1. Again, that's like plus or minus sign, not sine or cosine. And we'll also want to do that when we say x plus equals something. We can say x plus equals the sign of move underscore x. And that's going to work on the x-axis. We can make the same change to the y-axis like this. We're going to repeat the absolute value of move underscore y. We're going to check y plus the sign of move underscore y, and y plus equals the sign of move underscore y.
Hey.
Alright, so now if I run the game, we are going to be able to move around in our particular increments like this. We can still move left or right if we like. We can move up or down like this if we like. And it's still going to work no matter what our movement step is, no matter how close or far an object is from us, whether or not the distance is divisible by the movement step. I can now at this point make a more I can hold down the Alt key to drop down multiple objects at a time. I guess I can make like a little maze level and see if my player can escape it. To make this a little bit easier to play, let's go back to just checking continuously with the keyboard check function and not the keyboard check pressed function. What was that? Oh, did I hit like Windows key something? Windows key V is the emoji keyboard apparently. I'm just gonna Control C and V to copy and paste, and let's move our movement step. Let's change our movement step back to 4. Like this. And now, if I run the game, we should have some fairly satisfying collisions against anywhere in this little maze. And if I really try hard, I can sneak out through this little gap, and I can escape the maze. All right. So that's the basics of collisions. Let's see. Last notes about this. So we are now checking for collisions in a loop, and whenever you see something like this in code, you might think, is running a collision check in a loop going to be like bad for performance? And the short answer to that is no. The long answer to that is that GameMaker's built-in collision system is actually really well optimized. Even if you have a large number of objects in a room, all doing collision checks, GameMaker's collision system is pretty smart, and it will only actually check for collisions that are, like, immediately in the vicinity of the player, so it's not going to, like, loop over every single object in the room and check for collisions with every single object in the room every single time you run a collision function. The only exception to that is the HTML5 GameMaker export, but that's just one of many reasons that we don't like to talk about the HTML5 GameMaker export. Likewise, and this falls into a bit of a separate rant that I have. People tend to like to try to micro-optimize their GameMaker games, which this is the name for the general category of making changes to things that aren't actually slowing down your game. In this case, we have some things like we are like evaluating the sign of move_x multiple times in this loop, even though it's always going to be the same number. And like, feel free to take this out, and we can say like var step_x equals this. And now, instead of like x plus equals the sign of move_x, we can just say x plus equals step_x. Feel free to do this, but it's not going to make your game faster or slower. You can do the same thing on the y-axis if you like. Anyway, beyond that, there's a couple different modifications that you can make to this code to make it work in specific ways or to give it specific special behaviors. But this at its core is probably what's behind the collision detection of almost every GameMaker game. In fact, if you've ever run into the running gag in the GameMaker community of Sarah Spalding's collision code, or in the past it's gone by a couple other names, all that really is what you see on screen right here. Another thing to note is that I said that GameMaker has a whole bunch of collision functions, and I will be talking about most of them later, but a particular one of note is a relatively new addition, actually, and that is going to be a function called move and collide. And this is an interesting function which will do at least part of this logic for you. This function wasn't part of GameMaker for the longest time, so for the longest time, like, what I wrote out here kind of was just like the definitive edition of collision detection in GameMaker, but a couple of years ago they added the move and collide function, which will do some of this for you. It's definitely an interesting function, and it's definitely, at least in some cases, convenient where you can just use it and not have to do all this, but there are a few places where this function just doesn't work. For example, sometimes in 2D platforms it'll run into problems, and in cases like that, you might as well just know how to do this anyway. Until then, my name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. I'm going to start doing the thing here where if you want to see the code that I wrote in this video, I'll be putting it on GitHub, so look in the description of the video for a link to the GitHub repository. I like to post videos on all kinds of things you can do in GameMaker, so if anything like this appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. And indeed, in that game, our collision detection looks more or less like what you see here. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Zach Robinson, Squareco, Spydeye Games, Pixelated Pope, Paradox, Nykotic, Manta Ray, GameMaker, GameArt Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, Brenton, Bokeh Dev, and Argo the Knot for supporting these videos. If you want to join the ranks of these very cool people, head on down to the Patreon page in the video description to join the fun.